Welcome to TWC Live, everybody. There's been a lag before, so wanted to be certain I didn't get cut off as I did one time. TWC, as you must know or might know, is the Writer's Chronicle, which is the official publication of AWP, and we are here thanks to AWP and the Writer's Chronicle. And this is a series of live events that expands a conversation from the magazine. And one of our most read conversations from 2025 was on marketing your poetry collection. And two of the participants in that conversation are with us here today. And it was moderated by Natasha Kane, who I'm going to introduce in just a second. And then I'm just going to skedaddle backstage. But this is an opportunity as well for you to engage with the magazine and these conversations with your own questions. So about 15-20 minutes at the end of this hour will be set aside for your questions. So get those ready. And the other thing I'll say is if you miss any part of this, it will be available in its entirety in perpetuity on AWP's YouTube channel. I should probably tell you who the heck I am. I'm James Tate-Hill. I'm the editor of the Writer's Chronicle. And I am happy to now throw this over to Natasha Kane, whom I will introduce, and then she will introduce the other three panelists. So Natasha Kane is a Thai-American writer, editor, marketer, and educator. She is the associate editor of Trio House Press, and her work in publishing has been recognized in Book Camp's 40 Under 40 in publishing. She is the former editor-in-chief of the Talon Review and currently serves as their marketing faculty advisor while teaching at the University of North Florida as a visiting instructor. And Natasha is coming to us live tonight from Denver. So take it away, Natasha.
Thank you, JT. First, I'm going to introduce Cassie Manis-Murray. So Cassie Manis-Murray believes equally in delivering cold emails and cold pizza. She is the founder and director of Pine State Publicity, a publicity firm for independent and small press books. You can always find what she's up to in the Pine State newsletter. Her mom calls it weirdly rambling. Before launching Pine State, she was a literary agent, an MFA graduate in creative nonfiction, a book designer, a Best Americans Essays notable, a coordinating editor at a lit mag, a high school teacher, and once even a laundromat drive-through gal. When she isn't talking books, she's a mom to 3 kids, married to the guy she met on MySpace in high school, and living underneath some big oaks in North Carolina. Rebecca Hart Olander's poetry has appeared recently or is forthcoming in On the Seawall, Poetry Northwest, and Show Poetry Journal, and her books include Uncertain Acrobats by Cabin Cary Press 2021, a finalist for the Eric Hofer Book Award and the Massachusetts Book Award, and Singing from the Deep End. A Women's National Book Association Poetry Award winner, Olander's work has been supported by Straw Dog Writers Guild and the Mass Cultural Council. She recently served as the James Merrill Visiting Poet at Amherst College, works with graduate poets at Wilkes University, and is the publisher at Perugia Press. And finally, we have Karisma Charlie Tobin. Charisma Charlie Tobin grew up in the mountains of New Mexico and Alaska. She is currently the operations manager at TRP, the University Press of SHSU. Her work appears in Non-Binary Review, Hunger Mountain, Interim, Plain Songs, and others, including a roundtable in the Writer's Chronicle. Tobin holds an MFA in in creative writing, which is also certain writing, editing and publishing, and an MA in English and literature, both from Sam Houston State University. Welcome, welcome. Okay. So I think to kick off our conversation, I was thinking a lot about good ways for poets to connect with readers. And I'm thinking we can first start actually with reviews and features. So how does one go about securing reviews or other features? How can they query lit magazines, do reviews on big places like Goodreads, Amazon? Do those matter? And what are other published opportunities like guest posts and reading lists that we can kind of look at? And
think
maybe
probably the least exciting answer is check if they have guidelines, because if they do and you ignore them, that already kind of like sets you up as someone who's potentially going to be difficult to work with from their perspective. So make sure that if they have a process that's findable, that you respect that.
Absolutely.
I'd say my number one tip is thinking about all the places that have supported your work in the past, and check if those published reviews. And so say you have a new poetry collection out and you have a list of things you've previously published in that book. Certainly start with that group of journals and magazines. But I think even really beyond that, too, anybody who's ever published you, whether it's in that book or not, because they've already supported your work. So just make the assumption that they're, on your side and a fan of your work already. And then kind of try to narrow that down to maybe who publishes reviews. But also a lot of places will give you a shout out on social media. Even if they don't do reviews, they might just celebrate that you have a new book coming out because you're a past contributor. So, don't close doors prematurely, just kind of keep those open, and you're sharing your news, and who knows, you might tell an editor who doesn't do that or doesn't publish a review, but they buy your book or, remember about it and share it with someone. So, yeah.
I think it's always interesting. It's not like a one and done, like, oh, they posted my poem, we're done here. It's more like, I don't know, there's always like a community behind that where they're like very happy to celebrate you. So even if they don't do reviews, they're like, oh, we published you in this issue. Like, we're happy to support you. Congrats on having a book out.
Yeah. I mean, like, certainly there might be places who aren't super friendly like that, but generally speaking, most people are nice. And, most people are also poets or writers, and the ones who are editors too, and they know how it feels.
Yeah.
And it's nice on the, I don't know, like it also like does some healthy cross promotion, because then you can be like, oh, this person was in this thing. So it's not just, because sometimes, I don't know, for me at least, it can often feel very uncomfortable to be like reaching out to someone to be like, help me promote my thing. But it's not one-sided in that way. It's like, hey, I have done this cool thing. Let's promote our joint things together.
Absolutely. Yeah, that going back to what Natasha said is like, it's totally about relationship building. Yeah.
I would say in that, like, sending a cold email shouldn't be scary, because it's just the same place you would be in if you get a no. So the chance of a yes is great, and the surprise is great. My advice to people who are sort of doing it DIY is always like, fire up, do a trope, or Poets and Writers has like a big list of literary magazines. Go through them, see who's publishing reviews, and reach out. And then I would say, look at where all of your comp titles are reviewed. So like poetry collections that are of similar themes to yours, have similar forms to yours, writing in the same like contemporary landscape, topically relevant, even like inspiration. Sometimes I would say, like, where have they been reviewed? Who reviewed them? Often it's not like the literary magazine umbrella. It's like a contributor or a freelancer or a fellow poet. Reach out to them and see if you can do like a, hey, let's be in conversation. Let's both talk about our books. They're about XYZ. To really bring in both of you, and then you can both share it on socials, and you can both share it on your newsletters, and then maybe you create a panel for AWP, like, again, relationships. But yeah, those things are helpful.
Yeah, I love Cassie like reaching out to like a fellow poet too, because I always find like even in interviews, like the online and print, I find it great when like you could tell two poets like know each other and they're both like discussing each other's work, and they're like, oh, I noticed you do this, and like, yeah, but you do that in this book. And it's like, it's always like such an engaging conversation to read through and kind of see how like they're both kind of understanding each other's work. Yeah. What other sort of publisher opportunities would you guys, kind of recommend that authors kind of look at. Like, I know for me, like a big one is Day Beautiful, and they do a lot of debut poets features. Are there other ones that you guys would recommend?
I think I'm thinking of like magazines that often run like reviews and conversations, like Adroit does a whole block. Tupelo, Colorado Review, Bomb, Brooklyn Rail. Like once you sort of go down the rabbit hole, you will build a list of places that are good for your book particularly. Yeah, and I think part of what we're all saying is like get to know, like read other books, get to know who's writing in the spaces that you're writing in, who's being recommended on lists, why might they be on lists, who's like getting robust review coverage, like what are their books doing that are making that happen, sort of thing. Like what's the story around, pick a book you love, what's the story around it, and then you can sort of see how things are built from the back end, like how they built that review, those reviews, those interviews. If you sort of follow the trajectory of how things are moving, what they're talking about, what are the angles, etc.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cassie, you mentioned a couple. A couple that I just mentioned recently in a conversation were Literary Mama and Mom Egg Review, Myrrh Literary. And so those are for content about motherhood or written by mothers in some way. So that's another example of like thinking about the content of your book and matching it to the home for the potential review or interview or whatever. So that won't apply to everyone. But yeah, those are great places I wanted to give a shout out to.
Yeah. And then I also want to shout out Perugia because, of course, like you guys highlight color for, of the month. And like, I always find those reading lists are great because they really highlight the need for diversity in our collections as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to give an invitation while we're on our BIWAC Poet Spotlight. So we started running that feature at Perugia Press in September of 2020. So we've done, I think it's almost 70 maybe now. And write the description. So we run this once a month and we're publishing a little feature. It's not super in depth, but it's a woman of color poet who is an emerging poet. So has one full length collection, at least, that we're going to spotlight, or chapbook, but not more than one full length. So it's the same kind of poet we're looking for to submit to Perugia as well. And we're hoping those poets that we're spotlighting, because they don't yet have a second book, or maybe even a first full length, might think of Perugia to send their collection to in our annual contest as well. But yeah, we're just trying to use our platform to highlight emerging women and non-binary poets of color. And I just wanted to say there's a little description of what the feature is. And it's at the beginning, and it says, if you have folks to recommend. So like, if you fit into that category and you're listening to this and you have a chapbook or a full-length book, feel free to just email me and recommend yourself. It's not weird at all. So yeah, that's the invitation. Or if you have a friend who's in that boat, or a poet you admire, whose book is coming out and you haven't seen us highlight them before, I would just love folks to know about it.
Yeah. Cold call Perugia.
My email's there in the contact page, so.
All right. Well, still wheeling on collaboration community. I wanted to ask you guys how collaboration community can help authors book, sort of reading events, be it at their local bookstore or even, at festivals, things like that. How can kind of community and collaboration kind of help, increase audiences for attendance, but maybe also, share the workload of things like promotion and kind of organizing a whole event?
I have so much to say about this. I'm not sure if I went first last time, but I'll try not to go first next time. So my latest book came out in February, and I've been living this walking the walk of the answer of this question. So I'm in a writing collective with 4 other women, and 4 out of the 5 of us live in Massachusetts, across Massachusetts, and all of us had books that came out within a year. One is coming out this fall, one came out last September, so it's like spanning the course of the year. And we've been doing just this. And it's definitely building audiences is important. We live across the state, so it's a small state, but still we're, I can come up with places in the western part of the state and they can in the eastern part. So it's like sharing venues, it's cross-pollinating audiences, definitely bookstores, places that will maybe order your book and put a little bit of time and money maybe into trying to have you at their store and in their space that they pay for. They would love to have a group reading versus just one solo poet usually, because the audience will come and then they might buy something from the bookstore because you're in that store, they're supporting you with their space. And so you want to support them back with a good event. And then, it just helps you can have like a shared Google Doc folder and put all of your author photos in there and your bios and help each other make social media posts and help each other post those things. So it helps you to be a little less shy when you're promoting on behalf of not just yourself, but others. At least I've found that to be true. So lightening the load. I'll stop there for now.
I think it helps too with kind of similar to what you were saying with bookstores, with like drawing a crowd, not just because you're reaching each other's audiences and, presumably, hopefully finding new readers there, but also like, I don't know, an event with one reader is awesome, but like you only go to it if you know that reader and you're excited about them. An event with like 3 to 5 readers feels like the literary equivalent of a concert, like there's a lot going on and there's different styles and there's different people. And like, you're probably going to find somebody that you like, even if you're just going in blind and you don't know any of the names ahead of time. I think that holds a lot of appeal. I've also seen some really cool things where people will partner multidisciplinarily, like doing like where poets and artists do collaborations, usually at the art gallery, or poets and musicians doing like alternating sets during an event to like, keep it from getting too, I don't know, to whatever, too sleepy, to like feeling like you have to be still all the time.
Yeah,
Too
we like to theme our events usually, like especially if you're doing them in a similar like city. Like if you want to like go to multiple places in your city, we like to say like, okay, this conversation is going to be about this aspect of the book and this is how we're going to structure it. And you're going to be in conversation with somebody who like can speak to that aspect. Sometimes that means like reaching out to a nonprofit that is related to something you're writing about. Like if you have a poetry collection about grief, like are there local grief organizations in your area that will be your conversation partner? Can you lead a sort of grief workshop or grief writing workshop with other poets with that organization? So yeah, I think like in terms of events, don't just think of them as like, okay, I'm going to read for 10 minutes with my fellow poets and then we're going to have a 20-minute conversation. They can be so much more expansive than that. That is like the classic, it does work. But I think poets sometimes relegate themselves to the area of poetry. They're like, I'm a poet, and you can do so much in that space, especially if you're writing a book that is like relevant in the culture in any way or has any organizational connection. So it's not just community within like writers. Think community broadly.
I love that. And also it can become a way to maybe like give back to your community or like give back to a cause or an organization too. And then people, I don't know, it's a way of bringing in more audiences, and people maybe want to give a donation to, say, the place that is the grief center that holds these workshops generally, but you're just the visitor. but yeah, you're kind of, it's like sharing the spotlight, whether you have several people up on stage reading and you're reading with your friends and your writing collective, or you're sharing the spotlight with that other organization. I think that's so true, that we kind of get stuck in our, like, we're going to read now. And even doing a Q&A is like a little more exciting than just a reading, right? And like, it lets the audience, you're shining the spotlight with them, and they're part of the circle. Obviously, like the listening and receiving and all of that that's an exchange. But yeah, I think even thinking about making space for questions like we're going to later, and different kinds of readings too, like mixing up, Cassie, you had said like themed things, but I just went to a round robin reading that was super, super cool, where poets read each other's books ahead of time and read a little bit of their own, but also something that they were inspired by in the other poet. And yeah, just finding ways to have us not just sit there and do the same thing is good.
I just want to shout out, if you haven't read The Art of Gathering, like, good book on just like gathering people and how to bring people together in sort of a scheduled setting, feel routine. It's very good, and it'll give you ideas for like icebreakers at your events, or like ways to open up space. Yeah, she also has a Substack, so you can follow her there too.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. And then kind of still leading in with our events, considering sort of, travel costs associated with, conferences and book festivals, what are things that authors can do to kind of maximize their time in those spaces, and marketing materials, things to go to, but also how can authors sort of participate in the conferences that they attend, or even festivals that they attend?
I think this is where that community involvement really helps you, because the more people you know, the more things you're going to be like invited into. Like, say at AWP, like if you have multiple literary magazines that you've published in, then they might invite you to read at their offsite, right? The people who know you are going to like invite you into panels, that sort of thing. I think when we are planning tours that involve like a financial burden for the author, if you're going to a city that's not your own, then we try to do like, okay, we're going to do a bookstore event, a library event. We're going to try to pair it with like a university that might pay you to come. We're going to try to hit like multiple tentacles in one place, so that you're not going just for one thing. Like you have a schedule, you're booked and busy in whatever city that you're in. So that brings in like more, that financial burden doesn't feel as tight, I guess.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like, we always kind of like encourage our authors to like check in with universities that you're an alumni of, because they're very happy to support you and invite you. And maybe, if you have professors that are still at those universities that want you to teach a writing workshop, like that's something we do at our own university. Like, oh, you're published, like, come show our students how you, accomplishment, and then, lead a fun workshop for them. Students love that. They want to hear from like, the authors who went here,
Absolutely. And like departments are always, especially in the arts and in poetry, are always trying to look for like concrete data to justify to the public, to administration, to whoever, to be like, hey, here's how we can prove that like we're valuable and we're successful. Our graduate went and published a book. Like alumni associations love that stuff. Like you're making them look good and they want to know about it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely think about your alum places and reaching out to the alum magazines and their, newsletter, like finding the alum networks there to tell them about your news, to share it. Think about your friends who teach and, whether there's any kind of crossover with your book and the subjects that they teach, or if you, like networking to find somebody who teaches in the content of what you're writing about. And definitely, like, I've taught for a long time as well, and universities offer like really ranges of what they can give for honorariums, but like you'll go to a poetry reading and you're probably not getting paid anything, or maybe you're getting paid $50 and it covers your gas, or maybe not these days. And a university might, there are definitely well-funded ones, but even a state university, will probably be able to come up with a couple $100 or something like that. So it's not like it's lucrative, but it can help. We do the same thing at Perugia. We figure out when our poet comes to town how to make sure that visit is not going to cost the poet money. Like, she might not go home with money in her pocket, but if she's coming from across the country, we're going to figure out how to pay for that visit. So that's what we mean by our partial travel stipend in our prize, like in the list of what comes with winning our prize. So we'll try to have a mix of events, like Cassie was describing, that will offer different things and try to make that, and be transparent about that with the poet, and make sure that it's comfortable and supportive.
Yeah. And I think even like kind of circling back to even like conferences, like I'm always like very genuinely happy to see that authors can kind of feel an actual community at conferences too. Like people coming up to them like, oh, I need your book and I need you to sign it. And they're like, me? I'm like, yeah, of course, yeah, I'll sign it. But also like the authors always fascinate me with all of the things that they make for their book that people love, like stickers and bookmarks and postcards. And, there's just all these things. Like we even have authors, they make like business cards where they're like, you can like contact me directly for like a reading event or something. And I just think like, it's interesting too, because they're just like in the moment building like another community almost. Like they travel to this thing and they're building another community, which I find, it's very fascinating to me. Yeah.
Also for folks who like, you're talking about authors who are making these things for themselves, like stickers and cards and stuff. There's just such a range of what presses will do for you or with you. So I think there are, you might have a press where you're really kind of doing most of the stuff by yourself, and you're not necessarily, there's not a team maybe with the press, like they've made your book, but they don't have the bandwidth to support you. So yeah, some of those things you do have to do on your own, or like even the more creative ones you maybe do at most places, but even something like a one sheet, like a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with your book cover on it and information about where to get it and your bio and stuff like that. Like if your press isn't doing that for you, you should find examples online and make yourself at least something that basic that you can send out with your queries and things like that. But I love that, like thinking about swag, poetry swag.
Yeah, like I have like 80 stickers on my laptop now. That's like each different book, and I'm like, it's fine. I read them all.
I do think too, we're having a conversation about like getting comfortable with asking too, like across the board. Like ask your press, like if there's an in-house designer, like can they design a sticker for me? Like they might say no, like, and you just have to get comfortable with like spend the year up to your release date, like getting comfortable with asking for things on your behalf, asking for things of your friends. Just asking if people want to be in conversation with you. Like, yeah, you just get comfortable in that space.
I told a friend recently, and this is like bears repeating, that when you're doing that asking, like persistence is so, so important. Because I think when anything from like the blurbs that you're asking for on the back of your book, to, probably not from your press. Hopefully they're responsive. Certainly ask them again if they haven't reached out. But if you're asking people for favors, like, will you support my book by publishing a review about it? Will you support my book by reading it and spending time and writing a blurb to go on it? Like, those are favors, and it's hard because we're all busy and we all probably do that ourselves for other people too. And it's labor that we're asking people to do. of love, but still. So it can get to feel like if you ask and then somebody doesn't write back, maybe they're, they don't want to do it, or they don't know how to say no to you or something. And most of the time it's probably that they just have a really full inbox, so like, don't be shy about querying again. And I definitely give up, like, as I'm trying to support one of Perugia's books and get, coverage, press coverage, an interview or a review, make a connection, and someone doesn't write back after a few times, like, probably that's not an open door, but one time is not enough and not enough times to ask. Like, definitely go back at it, because people forget and are busy, and it's not necessarily, maybe it is that they have to say no and they haven't figured out how, but definitely don't be shy about asking again.
And I think also, kind of to springboard off what both you and Cassie were saying, like, to be okay with people saying no, that like, that's just a thing that happens. It's just like, I've heard a lot of people be very transparent about, like, we submit our work to all these places and the vast majority of it is a decline, whether that's, just because of logistical reasons or because it's not a fit or because whatever. Like, that's just how the numbers work. That's just the statistics of it. And it doesn't mean anything about, that your writing isn't good enough or that, like, they don't like you, or it just means it didn't work that time. And I think keeping that in mind too with marketing stuff, that like, you reach out to somebody and it falls through, like they never get back to you after a couple times, or they tell you like, hey, sorry, I can't. Like, don't take that as a reflection of your work or like the worth of your book or of your writing. It just, it's just that all of the places that run these things get asked this dozens or hundreds of times every day or every week, and they can only say yes to so many.
Absolutely. I always tell my students, like, make people tell you no, and they look at me with like really wide eyes. They're like, the rejection. And I'm like, yeah, but like, what? It just happens. It's fine. You can move on. I was like, that doesn't mean like no forever. It just means like, oh, right now, like, it's just not a possibility for me. Or maybe right now there's something kind of like holding me back from helping you. But that doesn't mean they can't help you in the future. Like, it's not no forever. And it's also kind of getting used to like rejection as redirection, right? Like, okay, not right here, but in a different way could work. Yeah. Going into sort of, interviews and guest speaking, I did want to bring up podcasts because I feel like that's something that's kind of, been really great for the poetry community. We love listening to poems and we love hearing our poets talk about their poetry. I just listened to the Larry Mama interview Martheus Perkins and like hearing him read his work, and I'm like, oh, what a gift. And then I was like, Literary Mama has a podcast, and I was just like just scrolling through, and yeah, it was great. So I wanted to ask you guys, how can poets find podcasts to be a part of, and are there some podcasts that the three of you would recommend?
I mean, I feel like all roads go back to building community.
Yeah.
So, like, I mean, I've been on a bunch of podcasts with my new book, and it's been so amazing. It feels like that's a whole new thing. My first book came out my first full length came out in 2021, and that just wasn't really as big a thing just a few years ago. But it's lovely. It's a conversation like this, and it's pulling back the curtain. I mean, I wasn't even listening to them until I was asked to be on my first one. Actually, it was after my first book came out, so that's going against what I just said. But there's a podcast locally recorded at UMass Amherst called Poet Talk. Ellen Miller Mack is the host, and you can find it on Spotify and any place you listen. And I guess it was 2020. I think it was just 2024, so it was a couple years after my book came out. But just she's a local poet, and so that's, I don't know. We knew about each other locally, and she was asking friends of mine who I know locally to be on. And let's see, what was I going to say about that? Poet Talk. Well, I just went back on that one. Building community, I guess, like that came because like it wasn't a query. I was asked because I knew her and she was, starting this new venture back then. I think just sort of like with review places, making a list of those that you love and trying to find a good fit for your work and yourself and what you talk about and care about. I love Of Poetry, the podcast Han Vanderhart they do from River Press editor. Let's see. This is what I was going to say. Ellen modeled hers on the New Yorker podcast, which is like you go on with Kevin Young and like read a poem that was in the New Yorker and talk about it, and then read your own poem that was in the New Yorker. So hers is modeled after like bringing in a poem that you love and sharing it, and then reading some of your own work and talking about it. But I had never heard the New Yorker podcast in 2024, so I went and started listening, and now I'm kind of a podcast, poetry podcast junkie. But there's another one I'd like to shout out called The Wild Story. It's a podcast of poetry and plants, and the poet Ann Wallace does that in conjunction with the New Jersey Native Plant Society. And so it's weird. I've recommended my poets for it, poets I've published at Perugia. I'm a friend of Anne's. I blurbed her book. I love her work. Like, we're connected in all these ways. I didn't think of myself for this podcast. But she read my book and saw things in it. So that was really nice. So I guess I'll stop with the recommendations, but I'll say, like, again, I'll reiterate, don't close doors prematurely, because it was lovely that she asked me, but I just didn't even. It's hard to think about promoting yourself, and you have to just keep trying to do it. But anyway, I'll let others recommend other ones too.
I would just say, like, assume everywhere has a podcast. Like, we worked on a novel about pizza delivery recently. And there are so many pizza podcasts, or baseball, or like, you can just think of anything and there's a podcast, or 10. And so don't limit yourself to poetry. Your regional NPR stations are often going to have conversations with authors, so you want to reach out to those. Also, just like your college stations, like locally, usually have good like talk radio. There's several great poetry podcasts. There's several like at the intersection of things, like he was just saying, like plants and poetry. Literally, I would just get in like Apple Podcasts or get on Spotify and like search up an author's name and see all the podcasts they've been on and like what the conversations are. I think it's easier to search by author's name than it is book, probably. So that's what I would do. Or just start Googling. Like, my book has XYZ in it, so XYZ podcast. And then you want to frame sort of your pitch, like if it's not a poetry podcast, you want to frame it as like, I have this new book out. I talk about these 3 things, and I would love to talk to you about them in this way. I haven't seen this angle on your podcast before. So like, you're a new conversation to this person. Yeah, I love Poetry Off the Shelf, which is a Poetry Foundation podcast hosted by Helena de Groot. I love the New Yorker Poetry Podcast, Poetry Vessel. Yeah, I'm thinking of a million like NPR shows, but yeah, there's so many.
Well, going back to community too, I think don't overlook something just because it seems like it's too small. Because especially if it's something that you have some connection with, or that like you are already in some kind of relationship with someone who's involved with it, because like we at TRP, we used to cold email a lot of podcasts, and we went through a while back and like culled our list down because a lot of them just had gone under and didn't exist anymore or whatever. But the podcast in particular, we often didn't get a lot of responses from, except when there was already a connection. And those ones were some of the most like fast and engaged. They were like, oh my gosh, I love so-and-so. I would love to like chat with them. You know, can you put us in touch if they didn't already have it? Or we had one poet a few years ago who she had some stuff going on and couldn't do a lot of traveling. But she knew a lot of people who did blogs and did podcasts and things just from being in the community for years and years. And so she did like a podcast tour, and it was mostly people that she already knew, a lot of whom had really big audiences, a lot of whom had really small audiences. There's kind of the whole range, but it was really successful for her, both because, you know, the thing itself, you're getting introduced in front of different audiences, but also it was like a constant stream of kind of what y'all were saying earlier about how people just forget things because there's a lot going on. Like you want to get your book in front of people's like awareness as much as possible without seeming obnoxious about it, which I feel like it's hard to seem obnoxious about it when it's your own book. But like being able to talk about, oh, I have this event coming up, oh, I was on this podcast, and like those types of things, like that's anytime you can talk about something like that, that's a new thing for like to go out into the world for someone to be like, oh yeah, so and so wrote that book, I should really read it one of these days.
Yeah. And I think, you know, sort of talking about those things and those features is kind of a great segue to the nitty-gritty of social media. Because, you know, it does feel like reviews, podcast features, being at an event, it's all content, you know, that you can create and choose to share with your audience. So I wanted to ask you guys, you know, what kind of, you know, content would you guys recommend authors create to share on social media? How can they create that content? And also, how can authors choose a social media platform that works best for them? Because there are so many, and I am only on Instagram. I refuse to interact with the others. Like, I have accounts, but I feel like a sleeper. Like, I'm just like every 3 months, I'm like, oh, repost. And then I'm like, goodbye. Someone was like, oh, this is on your Facebook. And I was like, I haven't been on that in a year. I didn't know that. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop.
I think it's going to vary. Sorry, thanks. I think it's going to vary depending on, I mean, it's always maybe for some people this isn't true, but for me and most of the people I talk with, it's always uncomfortable and awkward. You're like, you know, curating this public persona and you're marketing yourself, and it can be really uncomfortable. But at the same time, you know, that aside, I think what is comfortable and what is authentic looks different from person to person. So some people are really good at using Canva or other, you know, whatever design things, and you can do some really cool stuff that's pretty easy and on like free software, and like doing, you know, blurbs and review quotes or like a snippet of like one gorgeous stanza or sentence or whatever. And that can do really well, especially if you have like a cool aesthetic that like vibes with people visually. But also like for some people that is just hours and hours of frustration, and like it's going to feel really forced. And, you know, if that's the case, then maybe spend those hours on something more productive that's going to be like more fruitful. But videos I think do really well. We have a couple of poets right now who are finding like really engaging ways to do videos, sometimes just talking about like reading a poem or talking about like some aspect of something that's in the book, or talking about like, hey, I'm on my way to go do whatever, like, and it's not like a book trailer, like something that's a high production value, just like, you know, having this moment where you're like, I'm excited about this thing, and you just kind of share that with the world. But like same thing, if that's going to be really forced, then maybe try something else.
Yeah, I would say like the biggest thing is authenticity. And I've been told, you know, don't try to do all the platforms, like do what you're doing well, you know, in terms of thinking about your own bandwidth. And if it helps you to do that self-promotion, which it does for me, I think about the press that published me, the press that's like putting their heart and soul and dollars into making my book, and I want to make them proud. I want to do well by them. And I think that can help me to like not feel like it's just selfish. Like I've made this book, and it's something that I'm doing with this press, and they helped me to put it into the world. And so it's kind of my responsibility to do well by it as a poet. And that kind of helps to put it over here. So it's not just like me. And then sharing stuff, about other things other than yourself. I mean, that's what I try to do, is have a mix of things, because I get sick of myself, as well. So.
Yeah, I always tell writers to choose your player. Like, if you're like a short, snappy writer, like, then you should be on Threads or Blue Sky. If you are a video person and you like to talk, then TikTok and Instagram. If you're like a long form writer, then get on Substack. Like, choose your player, and like Becky said, like, do it well. And then I had something else to say and I just lost it about social media. Yeah, I don't know. I will say, like, we always tell our authors, like, to create content as you're in the space. So, like, if you're at an event and you hear something really interesting, like, answer that question later on your Substack, Blue Sky, Instagram. Like, if you can't get to it, like in this Q&A that we're about to have, like the questions that you're giving, I'm going to be thinking about for our Substack at Pine State, right? I'm going to be thinking like, okay, how can I answer this? Pull quotes from your own book. Like, you have a whole book of content, so use it.
Okay. Well, I think now is a good time to move into our Q&A session. We do have a few questions. One is, how polished does a collection/chapbook need to be before we approach a publisher? And do they have editors on staff?
That's a little complicated, right? Because there's like a mix. I think the vast majority and probably all publishers have editors on staff. I don't think I've ever heard of one that does it, but but there's like a mix of like, the book needs to be close to ready, because an editor wants to work with something that's already beautiful, and they're like, I see the vision, I see what this is trying to be, and I can help it get there, and like do a reasonable amount of back and forth and like giving advice and all those types of things. And so it has to be like at the point where that's easy to see, because there's going to be so many submissions and so few slots that you want to make sure that you're sending out the best that you can, that it's ready. But at the same time, there will be edits, and some of them you will look at them and go like, oh yeah, that's the thing I was missing all this time. And some of them you'll be like, what is this person thinking? And like, you have back and forth in a dialogue, but like it's both, I would say.
Yeah.
I kind of think that like the place to have that editing happening on your book is not probably at the press. Like if you know that your book needs work and it's not really ready, and you think, well, what if I sent it to the right press and they saw promise and they would help me make it ready? I think if you know that about your book, then probably like spending time with a collective and a writing group and like sharing it with your friends and getting feedback and working on it more. Like, you can send it, but the chances of it getting accepted will be lower if it needs a lot of work. That said, like, editing always happens. Well, not always, it depends on the press, but we definitely don't take a book that we've accepted and just publish it. Like, a whole editing process happens. So I do think Charlie's right. It's a mix.
And I think, like, as poets, though, it's never going to feel 100% ready is also a thing of, it's just poet nature where you just want to keep fiddling and, it's never going to feel quite right. But I think, I really like, Becca, what you said about like kind of getting into collectives, because it does kind of establish you in your local writing community as well as sort of a pre-published author or someone who wants to be published. Everyone in that collective is working towards the same goal and building that community. Getting those edits from fellow authors can really help you. But I think, if you're, reading a poem and it's like, oh, just then I'll just bury it in the middle. It's like, well, you know, every poem kind of matters, and also thinking thematically about like kind of the arc of your book as well. Like, how are these poems in conversation with one another? You know, how, if, you know, an editor reads this book before editing it, you know, how would they define your book as well as something that they feel is right for their press?
Well, and structure too, that like what you were saying about the themes and the content and the way that the book is interacting with itself. When we get submissions that like it's very obviously not a collection, it's just someone wrote a bunch of poems and put them together until it hit the page count, like those are not the ones that make it very far, because it's a collection is like a mixtape. Like it has to have a trajectory and like an order and like a flow.
Yeah. It's a playlist. Okay, next question. When is it too late to market your book? And is it too late if it's been out for a couple of years?
I mean, I need to jump in as Perugia because we've been around for 30 years. We're about to publish our 30th book, and we just do one a year. And so when I go to AWP with a table, I have all of the books from over all the years, because poetry doesn't necessarily have an expiration date. So there is this feeling of like the first year of your book is really important, and, you know, getting reviews before it's published so people have their hands on it when it's new. Like there's certainly that attitude. But no, I mean, I think, I don't think it's too late if it's been out for a couple of years. I think it's more challenging because we have this, the reality is we have this, you know, quick flash in the pan. And also there's just an embarrassment of riches. Like there's a whole new crop of books that comes and gets the attention. But it unless you've written something that is like only relevant for 2017 and that year or something, like probably someone wouldn't have published it if it didn't have lasting power. So yeah, I don't think it's too late necessarily, but you might have challenges in like the landscape as you try to get people to do a review of it or something. You might have to get more creative.
I think it's easier sometimes, at least, to do events and interviews with a less recent book than it is to do reviews, because especially a lot of the bigger reviewers, they want to be the first to cover it, or like they want to, you know, within a very specific time frame. But like no one is ever, you're not going to just stop having things to say about craft or about poetry, like, and those are always going to be things that you can do. But yeah, absolutely, like keep that book alive.
Yeah, I will say it's like poetry is a longer tail than nonfiction and fiction for sure. I will say it's going to be a hustle if you want that. Like you're going to have to be hustling out there. Lots of magazines will say on their guidelines, like if it's past a year and a half old, like we can't review it anymore. What you can do is like build up the platform for your next book. Start looking at the angles in that book, start looking at the themes, start seeing the bridges between the first book and the second book. What can you talk about to move your, I know people hate this word, but like author platform to the next book? Like, how can you connect them? Can you reach out to authors who have new books out to say like, I want to be in conversation with you. I think our books have like, but you're going to have to put that work in. I think, yeah, I will say like invitations are not going to continue probably like years past. You're going to have to be doing a lot of that outreach and a lot of that research, which is time consuming.
Okay. And then next question. How would you find reviewers to review your collection / as well as possible outlets to publish the review?
Great question.
I know we keep coming back to community, but in a lot of ways, that's the easiest place to start. Like, especially if you are in community with other writers or with academics, especially like if you can get a professor to like assign your book to their class, that's huge. But also just everyone is also going to be connected with other people. So if you're sharing with your circle, like, hey, I just got this book out. It's really exciting. And then the next week, one of those people is talking to someone who like runs a podcast or like a review place or whatever. And they're like, oh, I'm really interested in books that are about this. That like that connection can happen. They'd be like, oh, actually, have you heard of so-and-so? They're really great. Or looking beyond things like US Review of Books and like the New Yorker and trying to find things that are more niche in some way, whether it's like regional or it's like specific to a genre or a demographic or, you know, whatever. But like the things that are more specific tend to have more room.
Yeah. And there's also, so there are places that have staff to write reviews. Not many, but some. And staff doesn't mean like they pay, like there's a paid staff. It means like probably there's a bunch of people who love poetry or whatever they're reviewing. And they're trying to make a name for themselves with their writing, and a review is a piece of writing. And when you publish it, it's a publication credit for yourself. So like certainly that, you know, that's a thing for the reviewer, but it's a labor of love. For the most part, and in terms of whether they're getting paid, probably not. So anyway, some places will have a small staff or folks that will review for them. And then a lot of places will want you to send a finished review, or not necessarily you, but the reviewer. And so that's sort of the two tiers. So you're going to make a list of places that have published you before and places that you think would, you know, be a good match for your book that you put out, places that are affiliated with where you went to school or where you grew up, or, you know, all of these connections that do publish reviews and maybe have a staff. And then some of them you'll find out don't, and then you'll want to reach out and again, community, like, do you want to trade reviews? Like, what, you know, or put it out there to a Facebook group you're on, or to Instagram in terms of like a direct message. Is there anyone who's interested in this? And then you can field those. You don't have to send review copies to everybody. But yeah, it's querying and asking. And I think, Cassie, you were saying like Poets and Writers has great lists. So I'm sure that they have lists of journals. So maybe just like perusing that and looking for the ones that have review in their title is probably a good place to start.
I do think like social media is like a great tool for kind of also like gaining reviewers as well. Like I've seen in the past, like Adroit Magazine is looking for a review of this, or like, you know, you can go at Submittable. There are magazines looking for book reviews. And just going on social media and just asking like, hey, would anyone like to review my book? I'll send you a copy. It's for this magazine. And then even like in the future, kind of thinking about like how you can help the author in the future. Community, you know, it's just, again, that it's, you know, likely, you know, a poet who also wants to help you grow as well. And then another question, and our last question. How do you get onto Poetry Podcast? I sent a bunch of PDFs of my new books to them and got no response.
Okay, so with anything you're doing outreach for, you need to pivot from like, I need this to happen to what am I offering? What can I offer? And that is how you do those asks, I think, is like, I can talk about X, Y, and Z. I have this aspect of my book that deals with a death in my family. I don't know why my brain is going like all terrible things, cancer, plants, you know, like you have to, the like 3 levels are like, make the connection of why you're reaching out to them. Like, what is it about them that you like, the compliment, you know, and then what can you offer? It's not an ask, it's an offer. So like, instead of being like, I'd love to talk about my new poetry collection on your podcast, you would say like, I can offer you conversations about XYZ. You wouldn't say that exactly, but just think about like what the audience of that podcast would want to hear, rather than like what you can tell, sort of thing, is how I would say reach out podcasts.
Yeah. And you're kind of like the way that Cassie was talking about the author platform and like thinking about your next book and you're like building in a trajectory, like this is like a long road. So it might be hard to get poetry podcasts when you're a debut author. Or you have like your first chapbook out, like it will be harder to get some of the things. And then when you have your second book, then that will start to happen more. So just, I guess, think the long game, like your relationship building, becoming part of a community. Maybe you're doing some of this stuff for other folks, reviewing, blurbing, or that kind, being on social media, supporting other people's work, and celebrating it in that way. And it's not transactional. It's that you're being an active part of a community that will give back to you, because it's a relationship, and it sometimes does take a while. I don't know that that's the note to end on, but like I'm trying to stop because it's been an regret time.
Yes. I mean, I really like this idea of like focusing to like on, like, we said community so many times, but it's just that, I mean, again, it's, I think marketing might make people feel that it is transactional, but I think, I think marketing, especially in the poetry community, is much more authentic too. It's, everyone's trying to help each other, spread their poems to their readers, help other readers engage with their work. And I think too, it's also, authenticity, doing what works best for you. What might work best for one poet might not work best for you, and that's okay. Finding sort of, the thing that works best for you in your book. And yeah, engaging with the community. It's going to end us, but thank you all so much for being here, and thank you all so much for your time, and thank you to AWP and the Writers Chronicle for hosting us to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Am I back on?
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for this conversation. Natasha for moderating, Cassie, Rebecca, Charlie for your insights. It's really fabulous, and you covered a lot of different ground from the print conversation, which, if anybody missed it, that was December 15th issue from 2025. You can go back through if you're an AWP member or a Writers Chronicle subscriber. There's different material in that, so it's impressive that you covered so much ground there and here. And if you tuned in late while the conversation was in progress, this will be up on our YouTube channel in perpetuity. You can go back and watch, fast forward, pause, and be on the lookout for future AWP video content from the Writer's Desk or TWC Live. Sign up for AWP's newsletter if you haven't already. And I think this is a good place to say thank you for coming. On behalf of AWP and the Writers Chronicle, I'm James Tate Hill. Thank you for being here. Happy reading, happy writing, and happy marketing, right? Thank you all so much.